Unattended heater caused the fire at the Bank of Lisbon building in downtown Johannesburg in September 2018. Now, the building at the time was being occupied by various government departments. And yesterday, the report into the blaze was finally made public. 3 firefighters died trying to contain the fire. And that happened over 5 years ago now. Fire safety equipment in the building was also inadequate. So when the fire started, it quickly got out of control. The report also highlights that government departments who occupied the building failed to do any fire safety compliance checks, which is really a shocking lapse. And I'm joined now by Wynand Engelbrecht from private firefighting company Fire Ops. Wynand, thanks so much for joining us. What did you make of the report 5 years after the event?
Well, firstly, I think the 5 years is ridiculous. And going through the report, I tried to dissect it in a sensible fashion, but it can't be done because there's no scope defined in the beginning of the report. So one doesn't even know what the instructions were to the report writers. And I think to come to the conclusion that it was a heater that started the fire, as far as I'm concerned, it may be a good guess, but I'm not so sure that was done professionally. So the report came out without the necessary annexures, so one couldn't even look at the annexures. But the report itself is, as far as I'm concerned, almost inconclusive.
So, you know, the official version is that someone left their heater on or their heater was accidentally turned on, and it seems it was a situation with multi-plugs and they didn't realize there were a lot of papers and it caught fire. But I think the more concerning thing is that the report does speak about fire hoses not having water in them in the building, that there were no fire safety certificates. So talk to me about the lapses and what is meant to happen whenever you occupy a building.
Yes, I think there was a bit of a distraction with the death of the firefighters and trying to concentrate on the cause of the fire. What should have happened is that the author of the report should first seek the actual inputs from those who are really responsible for the building or state buildings. And the one entity that we don't see mentioned anywhere is the Department of Public Works, who's really the patron of all state buildings. And unless the Department of Public Works actually take responsibility for their part of it, you know, the state buildings will remain in this condition that it is in the city. And so, yes, before a building can be occupied, the city's building control officer must issue an occupancy certificate, which is precluded by a fire clearance certificate. Now, the fire clearance certificates are done by the city's fire department. And apart from that, there are also other departments have to give inputs to declare that a building is really safe. So that when we look at the hoses, it's actually steel pipes that didn't have water in it. I personally saw some of the pipes that were cut in the basement. That's almost a result of poor management.
When you said the pipes were cut, why were they cut?
Well, it happens with a lot of inner city older buildings that you have characters that move into the buildings, they cut out illegally, cut the steel pipes out because there's no water in it, because the city don't always have water in the mains. And they cut it out and they sell it as scrap metal. And we've actually had photographs of the pipes that were cut.
Is this why there was no water in those pipes?
Yes. The weird thing is that when the firefighters, when they entered the building, they tested on ground floor and there was water. But the pipes were cut just beyond the first floor. And so when they actually arrived on the fire floor, then there's no water there. But it's really, there are so many elements to this thing and so many facets that I think trying to concentrate on the operation itself is almost, that should be the last element that should be looked at.
Yeah, I mean, so you've mentioned a fire clearance certificate, which, from what I can understand in the report, there wasn't one.
Well, there couldn't have been one. Looking at the building,
There's no way
at the
it would have
condition
passed.
of it, the moment before the fire started, that building could not have held an occupancy certificate.
So I mean, what is, and you know, this is not the first time. You and I had this discussion around Charlotte Mateke when you spoke about the fire doors in that hospital were absolutely not functioning.
Yeah.
And you said at the time it would take a long, long time to get that building fire compliant. Yes. And you were right. But we also saw with the Usindiso building in Marshalltown that horrific fire where 77 people died. That was a hijacked building, but still owned by the government. Why is government failing to uphold its own bylaws and laws in the city? What's going on? Is it just an overwhelmed municipality?
If we talk about the government, there are the two tiers, and the national government has distanced itself from its own national building regulations. So, for instance, schools and hostels and administrative buildings of the state, the national government, they're just not subject to the national building regulations, and the Department of Public Works is a law unto itself in this regard. As far as municipal buildings are concerned, they make and create bylaws, and then they themselves don't adhere to those bylaws. And so it's a matter of there not being individuals that take responsibility for anything. It is a collective responsibility that is being preached, and yet it's only investigated after the fact.
Yeah.
There's nothing done proactively.
The biggest irony for me was this Usindiso inquiry that began recently had to close down.
Yeah.
I don't think it started up again because the venue that had been chosen was found not to be compliant because there were too many people in the venue. And you know, it seems like a small thing until there's a fire.
Yeah.
And then it's an absolute deadly disaster, right?
Well, I made the statements over and over again that the Braamfontein Civic Centre is a death trap. And I see now they've shut it down and they're going to renovate it. But so are all municipal buildings. You can go into any library, you can go into any fire station for that matter. They've moved the fire safety division from Braamfontein to Florida Park. And I would like to see the certificate of occupancy for Florida Park.
I mean, that's just
and so
crazy.
If the government, if the agencies that are responsible for this, for monitoring the buildings that belong to private enterprise, don't even look after their own buildings, then how can they possibly expect that people will honor their authority?
The other thing that was really concerning from the report is that the firefighters didn't seem to have working radios, so they were in a burning building and couldn't speak to their team on the ground. I mean, that surely is the most dangerous thing.
There are two things here that's important. The one is that there wasn't an incident command established. That's the first thing. There should be an incident commander, a senior ranking officer, not a junior, not an acting platoon commander. It should have been a senior officer, number one. Number two, all firefighters that enter a building should have radios with them so that they can call a mayday. I have repeatedly said it's important that these firefighters should be issued with two-way radios. They can't call from a fire engine to the control center to report mayday. Mayday is an exact and a very precise something that happens in a few moments. It's real time. With mayday being called, there ought to be a rapid intervention team outside waiting to retrieve firefighters that had gotten into trouble. So these two things are crucial for me. But it doesn't speak to me on that operation. It says something to me about the Johannesburg City Council not maintaining a professional fire brigade. You can't have knee-jerk reactions and then, as in this report, now you turn against the dead firefighters and you blame them for these things. How callous is that? The city ought to maintain a professional fire brigade, and they ought to honor the international rules of engagement.
We are out of time, but I have to ask you one final question. What can fix this? Because really this fire has painted the picture of lax building controls, a lack of care, a lack of following the rules, and also fire safety officials who are ill-equipped in the face of deadly danger?
Well, we know we've learned nothing from it. I mean, just 5 years after it, at 80 Albert Street, we lose 77 lives. So what has been learned? Just nothing. It's a repetitive promise that's just going nowhere. I think we need to take introspection, and we need to look at these things in a professional fashion. If indeed this is a world city, then let's act like it's a world city.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming in to chat to us. Such an important story. That is Wynand Engelbrecht. He's from the private firefighting company Fire Ops. Now, still to